Hello, everyone. Russ of Aquarimax Pets here. I am here with Phil and Logan from Josh's Frogs. They are from the Invertebrate Production Team over there at Josh's Frogs, if I said that right.
Yeah.
And why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about yourselves and what you do over there.
Sure. My name is Logan. I am the Invertebrate Breeding Projects Manager. So it's kind of a mouthful of a title. But I basically just make sure all the bugs continue to make more bugs.
And I'm Phil. I'm the microfauna manager at Josh's Frogs. So I'm in charge of like all of our isopods and millipedes and springtails and all the microfauna that does your cleanup crew.
Cool. So to differentiate that, it sounds like your jobs intersect.
Yeah.
To quite a big degree, but how do they differ?
Well, I mean, I'm his boss, so I can get to tell him what to do. But like my job is a lot of people stuff. So, I mean, and microscope stuff. I also hold the entomologist badge at work. So I do a lot of just kind of weird bug identifications and research. But yeah, pretty much all my job is I'm sitting on the computer. I'm helping out everybody, just kind of making sure the overall structure and everything is running smooth, taking care of like a lot of the bigger picture and bigger issues. Whereas Phil is a lot more of the hands-on doing the real work.
Yep. I'll do a lot of the frontline work alongside our employees and a lot of the small scale planning around like when we want products out or how we need to breed these insects this way or just how we need to make it happen.
Cool. So just to give everybody an idea, can you give us sort of an overview of the different invertebrate taxa that you work with? We know, of course, isopods, springtails, things like that, but what are some of the other things you work with?
List it all.
Yep. Well, we work with silkworms, beetles, what else? Flies, isopods, millipedes, springtails. We'll be working with firebrats in the near future.
Oh, cool.
We also started working with some like aquatic crustaceans. We recently started getting into vampire crabs.
Oh,
which, yeah, are kind of similar to keeping isopods. At least we convinced ourselves that. What else? We have been doing some hermit crab stuff, which is pretty cool. Yeah, I think that's it.
Cool. You know, back in, when was it? It must have been about 2007, I think, was my first purchase I ever made from Josh's Frogs, if I remember correctly. I bought some fruit fly culture materials to start culturing fruit flies at that time. And I have cultured fruit flies almost continuously since that time. So
nice. Has it been the same original stock?
No, I've restarted a few times, but
I'm going to say that would have been really impressive.
Yeah, I did keep them going for quite a while, but after a while, I think there's some inbreeding that goes on that's not necessarily, you don't necessarily have ideal stock anymore if you let it go too long.
Yeah, fruit flies have weird genetics. They're simple, but they're weird.
Yeah, well put. I think that's a good point. All right, so why don't we dive into some of the questions we have written down here. One of the things I wanted to ask you about was how commercial production of isopods and the other microfauna and so on that you deal with differ from, how that differs from hobby level production of such things. Yeah,
no, it's a good question. I mean, you think of the difference between what is hobby level and what is commercial level. I think one of the main kind of things that determines that is just the amount that you keep. So you kind of think of a general hobby level keeper, passion project. You generally don't have 3 rooms floor to ceiling of isopods. Another main difference that I think is cool is like we have rooms dedicated solely towards like Pronosis. And so like where most people might have a couple colonies of powder orange. How many do we have?
Definitely over 200.
Yeah. So just like the quantity is so much higher.
And that allows us to that's a different aspect for commercial as well, as kind of being able to dive into the individual care needs a little bit better of a few different species that might fare well at better parameters, and we're able to kind of regulate that per room, which really helps.
Yeah, we're able to set each room to different temperatures and humidities and stuff, so we can keep a lot of the kind of more tropical stuff to one room, a lot of the warmer loving things to another room. Really just try to dial in the care.
I like that. Because as a hobbyist, I guess I'm sort of relegated to keeping the stuff that likes it warmer on the higher shelves.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
That's about the extent of climatic control that I can offer.
And we've definitely, we've struggled with that too. I think just today we finally decided to stop keeping isopods on a very specific shelf because something about that specific shelf just got everything dry every time.
Yeah. It's funny how the microclimates in just different parts of the same room really do some strange things.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, this is fun. Joe's first stock of zebras.
Hey,
Josh's frogs. Awesome.
Glad to hear it. But it's definitely breeding on an industrial scale is definitely, it comes with different pros and cons. Mm-hmm. One of the really fun things, I mean, I like to say that we're hobbyists working, in what is it, like the mass insects breeding industry or something. Mm-hmm. So one of the perks of having 200 plus powder orange bins or 60, 80 plus giant canyon bins of all these kind of like core species is we're able to pull out a lot of really cool morphs when you have that many colonies. We find some weird stuff.
Right. So for example, we're able to go into like a large section, say just Procelio dilatatus, for example, a species that doesn't typically have a lot of variety in the hobby, where we'll have 80 colonies and we have 4 different like morphs in isolation of various different colors that have appeared that maybe nobody's ever seen before.
Cool. That's awesome.
And that's kind of one of those. Oops, sorry.
Oh, you go ahead.
Just one of those benefits of having that many available to you is being able to find those little gems.
Yeah. You get to improve the odds.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to encounter something like that. That makes a lot of sense. That's cool. I guess I hadn't really thought of that in terms of just the sheer numbers are vastly going to improve the chances there. But it's true.
Yeah.
Cool. And I also like how you mentioned you're hobbyists, but you're in basically mass production of these creatures, but you can't take the hobbyist out of you.
Absolutely not. Yeah. No, I mean, the people that are in there 40 hours a week, head down, sorting and scooping and setting up colonies, like they want to be doing that all day. Like they love it. Mm-hmm. And so it's pretty fun being able to be in this position where like you adore what you do.
Yeah.
It continues to bring you excitement.
Well, it sounds exciting. I think I need to put my resume in to Josh's Frogs now.
Absolutely.
We'll bring you over in a heartbeat.
That just sounds like a dream job to me. So yeah, maybe I really should. Yeah. So the next one is, how has the growing popularity of bioactive vivaria impacted Josh's Frogs? I've kind of seen that explode. So tell us what that's done. You can both just kind of chime in with your ideas.
I mean, I don't know if we would have jobs if it wasn't for bioactivity.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the biggest example is just like the mass increase in demand has just been exponential over the past 2 years. And I mean, it's evident in the amount of labor we put into the isopods and the amount of like colonies we have. So if we were to kind of give you a glimpse into 2 years ago, we had no more than 80 isopod colonies.
Like
total. And never spent more than maybe 10 hours a week working on them. Mm-hmm. Now we easily have over 500 isopod colonies and spend over 140 hours a week working on them.
Oh, wow.
And we're still
growing exponentially.
And filling our weeks up with stuff.
Cool. Oh, that's amazing. And I've noticed that over the years too, Josh's Frogs, when I started, purchasing things, was focused mostly on dart frogs, as was bioactivity to a large extent. And now you've not only branched out in terms of different types of supplies for bioactivity, but also in the diversity of species, mm-hmm. Both vertebrate and invertebrate.
Yeah, it's cool. I mean, our goal is to have our fingers in everything eventually.
Mhm.
Frogs have definitely been, at our core. I think that kind of really took off, I'd say, about 2 years ago, shortly after, I'd say, the pandemic started,
Mhm.
when we were thinking like, man, do people spend money on animals when, all this is happening? And turns out, yeah, they do. Animals and plants and bugs and everything. And yeah, they really, set us up for success and really just shot us up.
Yeah, I think that is. I've heard that from several different people, different businesses, hobbyists, whatever. It was the same for me as well. That
Mhm.
My mm, my business, I guess, took a sharp upturn is when it corresponded with the pandemic because people were stuck at home with uh, the computer and I
Mhm.
guess the chance to research. So Ruben had a question for you about Pronosis as feeders. Do you ever use that species as feeders or others?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So we definitely use Pronosis as feeders just because of how prolific they are, and they're soft-bodied, which is a great point because you should not feed hard-bodied isopods to your animals. Definite choking hazard there.
Right.
As far as like other feeders, sometimes we'll use Florida Fast, Lantosia floridiana as a feeder cleanup crew, and Solisticus convexus is also a good cleanup crew and feeder insect.
We also like to use the Porcellionides florea because
Oh,
they look so much like powder blues and powder oranges. And so we have to go through regularly. I mean, this is a lot of our time is going through and sorting out, the florea aside from the actual true powder blues.
mhm.
We want to send people real powder blues. And so we're left with a bunch of these, fake powders. And so, yeah, we'll use those as feeders. I think what gecko was it that you saying really likes the Ukraine pied or the
Cat geckos.
Cat
Cat
geckos.
geckos really liked the Solisticus.
Interesting. I and I've always thought of Silisticus as maybe harder bodied than Pronosis, but I've never really thought of them as feeders. So that's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of animals out there that you don't realize how much isopods are part of their diet.
Yeah, that's true.
Hmm.
And I mean, you can raise a lot of toads on basically nothing but isopods.
Oh yeah,
Yep.
Especially if you have a nice colony of dairy cows.
There you go.
It becomes really easy.
Never-ending food supply.
absolutely.
Exactly. So the beetle guy was wondering how large the isopod colonies get. Like, what is an example of like the size of a container you would use and a rough sort of ballpark figure of numbers that you'd find in a container?
Okay, so typically we're going to use like a 30 to 40 quart kind of flat tub because we're going to want that surface area over the height for most species.
Mhm.
And at any given time, there could be anywhere from 60 on a brand new colony to 3,000 isopods in one of our bins.
Nice.
We really like using the, I think, 37s.
Yep.
The 37 quart gasket bins from Sterilite.
Mm-hmm.
We like using those ones a lot. So we have all of our shelves designed to fit those. And then we keep our dwarf whites in 32s just so we can give them deeper substrate.
Okay, well, that makes sense with that species. Do you keep your dwarf whites far away from the others? Do they have your own dwarf white
room?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. We've learned early on.
Yeah, I was expecting to hear that. I just figured it's good for others to hear that too and get that into their minds soon, because I find that a lot of newer folks in the hobby don't realize what a threat dwarf whites can be to other colonies.
Yeah,
absolutely. And I think you do a great job of explaining that by kind of describing it as like teleportation, because they're not there and then they are.
Yeah. And it's, a lot of people say, oh, it happened. And a lot of times I will talk to them about what they, their husbandry and what they do to keep them away from the others. And they're just over on the shelf by themselves, right above my blah, blah, blah.
Right above them. Yep. Yeah, we keep our dwarf whites and all of our Pronosis in their own rooms.
Yep. I have a a special part of my room that's separated from the other part of the room that has my Pronosis and my dwarf whites, and the dwarf whites are on the bottom.
Nice.
Makes sense.
Oh, we got a super chat here. Mr. and Mrs. Morelia, awesome. Thank you. Love Josh's frogs. Only problem is they never have all the things I want at once.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, supply issues are certainly an issue everywhere.
And that's one of the issues of, like I said, wanting to get our hands in everywhere. We want to be able to offer everything, but it's hard getting everything in all the time.
Yeah, that makes sense. But yeah, glad you've had a great experience with Josh's frogs, Mr. and Mrs. Morelia. Excellent. Let's see. What's our next one? Our next one is, since your hobby and passion intersect so much with your profession, how do you keep the work-life balance?
I can go first on this one.
Okay.
I think it's pretty easy for me because I don't keep isopods at home, actually, despite it being the majority of my full-time job.
Mm-hmm.
I think that definitely makes it easy, so I don't have any of those kind of blurred lines between my work and my hobby.
Mm-hmm.
I definitely still keep aquatic arthropods and some aquariums and things like that at home, but just kind of the difference keeps it fresh and entertaining.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I've often wondered if I had like a facility separate from my home.
Mm-hmm.
I would certainly keep a few things at home, but I've often thought, what would I keep at home, and how would I make that distinction? Cool. And what about you, Logan?
See, I'm a little different. So I have a lot of animals at home, but it's also because I don't get to work with any of the animals at work. I do all the people stuff and computer stuff. And so I get off work and I go home to finally be able to, do all my fun animal projects and things like that. One of the cool benefits of it, though, is working here and managing and seeing how all of our Isopod projects are working, experiments, is I just got to take all that knowledge home and use it on all my colonies. So I don't have to go experiment on my cultures.
Oh, that's true. That's a good point too. Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's one of the areas that I find myself always wanting to have more time and space for.
Mm-hmm.
I always want to be able to. I have millions of ideas for experiments. Like, if I had time, I would do this and this, and I would determine what's happening here and why, and so on. And often I find out, well, I don't have the time, or I don't have the space. Often both are lacking, and I find that's something I'd love to do. So I think it's cool that you get to do that. Yeah,
and kind of going off that, but also jumping back to that first question about the difference between, hobby keepers and us in the industry. Excuse me, 1 second. Where was I going with that? Experimentation. One of the benefits of that is like we have people here where that's their job, and so just having that consistency. So we have people who we consistently feed our pods at same time every day. We have these same projects that people keeping up on every single day. So I'd say having that be your job definitely helps, keep things moving.
Oh yeah. That sounds super fun. I would just I would eat that up. That's awesome.
It's kind of easy to put some projects off to the side when you're at home. You're I just kind of want to take a lazy night, hang out, watch a movie or something, but you don't get to do that when you're at work.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Not while I'm watching.
And then you get to maintain that work-life balance, because you get to satisfy your curiosity and do those things at work, but then you don't have to worry about it anymore later. So that's pretty cool.
The saying is true, where it's, you do what you love and you're not working.
Right. Yeah. If you love it, it certainly doesn't feel like work.
Mm-hmm.
So I know this question may not apply entirely to you because you're the invertebrate guys at Josh's Frogs, but you also have kept a variety of creatures. So we'll just throw this up here and see if you have anything you want to chime in on this one. So for those who are just listening, it asks about an aquatic amphibian you would recommend for someone in a warm climate. They moved to Arizona. This is from Branded Guy. Moved to Arizona and love to set something up, but a lot of amphibians like it cool.
It's a
You
hard
think?
one.
I guess it depends on how warm you're talking. I mean, if it's, a container of water sitting outside in Arizona, probably not a whole lot.
Right.
But maybe like room temp, definitely quite a few different like newt species. I feel like you could probably get away pretty safely with like your African dwarf clawed frog.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And that, I don't know. I can't think of anything.
Yeah.
I guess it also depends on what they mean by room temp, because there are people who run their air conditioners to keep the house at a nice cool 85 in Arizona to save money, and
cozy.
Yeah.
So that might be stretching it for some amphibians, but if it's in the high 70s, I think that would make total sense.
I mean, at that point, just look at fish.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep. Some of the warmer fish, like get discus.
Yeah.
85. Cool. Let's see. There are some. Oh, here's one. Okay. The learning isopod man wants to know if isopods self-regulate population-wise if they are too crowded. Have you noticed that in your large setups?
Yeah, so it's funny. It's kind of interesting because out in the wild, when they kind of self-regulate after the wintering period, if there is one in their local area, of course, after they've kind of done their hibernation or brumation, more like it, since they're not actually sleeping, they kind of wander off. And they kind of use that as a metric because they'll never wander farther than a certain distance from their original colony. So if you find one isopod colony, it's pretty likely that there's another one within a pretty close radius to where you found the first. So what we notice in our larger bins like that, where I brought up that large surface area being important, we'll have multiple pieces of cork bark that have their own kind of archway to it. And it's almost like each piece of cork bark kind of establishes its own little colony where like this section fills up first, and then this section fills up, and then on to the next. And as they just kind of expand out into their enclosure.
Yeah.
Cool.
We also have, I mean, all of our isopods are on like species specific breeding plans. So when we start a colony, we start them with, X amount of pods. What is it?
60. Exactly.
60 pods. And so off of those 60 pods, we know, at what point this harvest or this colony is going to be at its best to harvest before they start self-regulating, before they start cannibalizing and doing stuff. So, I mean, obviously like Pronosis doesn't have to sit on the shelf very long before it's at that, the peak of, that the environment can support.
Right.
Whereas like Dilatatus, they're sitting on the shelf for a year or something before they even start really doing much. So they do self-regulate, but we try not to let it get to that point.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes sense. And since you're selling them, you have the chance to control that to some degree. I've noticed that with most of my colonies too. Anything that has any kind of demand, I never have to worry about it.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I often have to worry about, I have low stock and I have to let them replenish, and I don't have space to, for 17 bins of this species, I've only got 2 or whatever. And so, yeah, the opposite problem can happen. But yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And I think it's kind of fascinating that in the hobby, we often treat a colony as if the end goal is to produce as many isopods as possible. And in some cases, that is the goal. And when you're selling them for commercial production, that makes sense.
Right.
But a lot of hobbyists also, they let it go to full production, and they ask me, what do I do? I have so many dairy cows that are like spilling over the sides of this bin. What should I do? And I, it's interesting. Sometimes it's pretty easy to just say, well, you're putting huge amounts of input into the system.
Mm-hmm.
You reduce the input, you're going to reduce the output.
Yep.
That's basically how it works. But sometimes that's maybe overlooked. Maybe there need to be more discussions and more videos about that kind of thing.
Well, it's definitely the case, kind of jumping topics, but like springtails, for instance. I mean, we feed our springtails few times a week. And yeah, like we give them as much food as they're able to intake without going over, because as soon as you go over what they're able to intake, is that when you start introducing, pets and pathogens and nasty stuff. And so it's this balancing game, and it's
Right.
very similar with isopods. Is you don't want to just put a tons of food into a new culture. It's not going to work out.
Right. Right. And I love the fact that you start out with 60 as your initial stocking number. When people ask me what the ideal number to start with, I usually say go big. People are always, they're sort of conditioned to do a 10 or a 12 count, something like that. Not that there's necessarily anything wrong with that, but you're going to get a lot more reproduction, a lot more quickly, and it's going to be more consistent, and you're going to have fewer issues with that initial bloom of pests or whatever if you just start out with a nice number. So I love that.
I don't think for my personal collection, I don't think I've bought any like starters that are less than a 25 count. Just because you get a 10 count and like, yeah, you're going to end up with babies and it's going to end up doing its thing. But like, it's a 10 count. Like you might, which ones did we get that we had one female of a 10 count? Yeah, we got some Klugies that you got all 10, 12 showed up perfect and alive. We go under the microscope or magnifying glass and start sexing them. And yeah, you get one female.
Yeah. Yep. Something similar happened to me the first time I got magic potions. I think I got, I don't know if it was all males or all females. It was a long time ago, but I got them as little babies. I only got a 6 count and they grew up and they must have just been all the same sex.
Yeah.
I did not get any reproduction. And then the next time I started with like a 25 count or something, and boom. It took a little while to get them going. They were young too, but as soon as they started reproducing, just everywhere. Because you start with those bigger numbers.
That's my biggest fear of getting like the 5-6 counts of really cool stuff is like, what if you don't get a female? What if something happens?
Yeah. And people, when they ask, I have this setup. It's whatever it is, a 4x2 or something. And they want to start out with isopods and they ask me how many. And I try to encourage them to get a good number to start with for a container that size. When they get it that spread out, you start with a 10 count in a 55-gallon aquarium or something. It's going to be a while before you see anything. But if you put a 50 count in there, it's not going to be long at all. So totally makes sense.
Yep.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, so Veranid guy, a follow-up on the frogs. Tap water comes out pretty warm, but room temp is about 75 to 50 to 78. I don't know why I'm saying 50. Yeah, so that seems like the dwarf frog you were talking about.
Yeah,
that's not that hot. I was ready to hear like high 80s or something.
Yeah, and I have heard of people who, their house temperature with AC is 80 or above, and that can be problematic.
I don't even think we hit 100 here in Michigan this summer.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. Do you often get above 100 in the summers?
Maybe 3 to 4 days a year.
Okay. So it's not that much, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
We had, it was pretty nasty here. We had, in September, we had lots of days well over 100. We were getting like 105 and stuff. And it was, I know that's not like Arizona, but it was, it's unusual for September here. So
where are you at again?
I'm in Utah.
Utah, that's right.
In northern Utah. So southern Utah gets a lot hotter, but northern Utah is still, it can get pretty hot and stay there sometimes. Well, here's a millipede question from Base Gorgon. Advice for keeping and breeding millipedes. Who wants to chime in on this one?
I got this one.
Okay.
So biggest advice for keeping and breeding millipedes well is definitely remembering that you have to supplementally feed them. Their substrate is not their only source of food. That's like your biggest cause of failure. They're going to need moisture, and they will drink standing water if you give it to them. And most people forget that step too. And there's a lot of compaction issues that go around on the internet. No, it could be this or it could be that, but a lot of the times it comes down to not having that availability to open water that they're able to actually drink.
That's a good point. I think a lot of people just sort of forego, that water. When you provide water, do you use pebbles in the water dish or anything like that?
So we use really shallow, like deli cup lids. Okay. And we just use RO water. So even if they were to kind of like face plant or roll around in the dish, it wouldn't really cause them any harm or be deep enough for them to kind of submerge in it.
Okay, cool. I do like that.
Face planting.
It's a good point. And I find that giving millipede supplemental food, they obviously they'll go to town on it. Like I just threw a little bit of dog food in my Spirostreptus enclosure the other day, and they were just boom, they're just right on.
I think Another tip is just keeping an eye on the soil and the substrate.
Mhm.
They eat their soil and they eat this, detritus that's in it, but often you don't see that. And so, if you set your millipedes up in a, enclosure and you come back after a while of just kind of doing routine care without really checking on it, you'll notice the soil, it's compacted, it'll get flat. They've eaten everything typically other than the cocoa fiber. And so if that's left, that's not good. So like Phil was saying of like supplemental feeding, but also just, keeping an eye on your substrate and making sure it's healthy.
Yeah. A lot of millipedes, especially some of the faster breeding ones, can turn new substrate into frass awfully quickly.
Yeah.
Good point. So you mentioned earlier you work with beetles. At Josh's Frogs, do you work with any desert beetles?
We do not currently, not any like pet desert beetles, at least. Of course, we have dabbled with mealworm and superworm beetles, of course,
Right.
for breeding the worms. But other than that, no.
Okay. Cool. Well, Nolan was asking about good food for desert beetles. They're not very picky. A lot of people use dog food, dry dog food as a basic food. Beetle jellies to give them some extra hydration too. I also use either chopped sweet potatoes, chopped carrots for mine, freshly pre-killed crickets, dried mealworms. They'll eat almost anything, seriously. So, okay. Let's see. Just kind of going through the chat here. There's an interesting question about millipedes. I've never thought of that one. Millipedes bite into hydroballs.
In theory, I think they definitely could.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they'd actively pursue it, but I'd also hope that you weren't keeping them with hydroballs, kind of in the sense that they don't necessarily need a drainage layer, or they shouldn't really be with your normal kind of terrestrial animals just due to the toxins and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah, I've had a lot of people say, what do you think about millipedes as a cleanup crew? And I say, well, there are going to be some issues you'll encounter there, especially with the toxicity of the millipedes. Because I don't know of any millipedes in the hobby that don't, at least I can't think of any offhand, that don't excrete some sort of repugnatorial fluid of one kind or another.
Yeah, and there's such little research done on it. Like, there's probably some out there that'd be totally safe, but we don't know what they are. We're not going to risk it.
Right.
Not yet, at least.
Yeah.
Okay, here's one about mold. Violet wants to know, is mold in the beginning of an isopod colony a problem because springtails are eating it?
Is mold in the beginning of an isopod a problem? No. Springtails eat, they're pretty much, their diet is soil fungus. And so they're looking for fungus. And so molds aren't a problem. The only thing that does pose a problem with mold is really fuzzy mold. Those, I'm trying to remember what they're called. They're not tendrils, but hyphae. Yeah, the hyphae will snag and grab springtails and just keep them from moving. And so that's not the greatest. And so when I see them, I usually just give them spritz of water. Usually that just kind of resaturates it. And once it's saturated, then the springtails can eat it. I also stop feeding springtails until that mold clears away, just because, like we said earlier, you're putting more input than, what they can consume in there.
Right.
You're going to end up with pests or more mold or, stuff like that.
Yeah, good point. And that the hyphae can also capture young isopods too. So
yeah,
double danger there.
Double danger.
Okay. I've got a question here from Sandy. This is a Patreon question. I'm digging into the Patreon questions now. Sandy wants to know, how has supply and demand for feeders been for Josh's Frogs since the beginning of COVID until now?
Not that bad. I'd say, our feeders and like what we offer and what, we sell to our customers, like the amount of different feeders has gone up. So in the last couple of years, we've offered stuff that we haven't before, and we're always trying to get new things in and experiment with stuff. Our goal at Josh's Frogs is we want to breed everything in-house.
Mhm.
And so as far as like dubia roaches and, trying to think what else, pretty much just dubia roaches that we breed consistently, that's not a problem when, supplier issues or something. But I can't think of any really big issues of getting in suppliers. We'll have, a week late or shipping delayed or something like this. And that's a pretty common problem with everything.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, it's nice to know that it hasn't been a huge deal.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, here's another question from the chat. Eradicating forage flies in the colony.
Yeah,
This one hits home.
This one hits home because we have a 700 square foot room for dubia.
Wow.
Forward flies are a pain. I'll say that. The trick to that is getting something that competes with the forward flies. And so typically that's buffalo beetles, just kind of the easiest to get and easiest to use. Dermestids work well too. Those are kind of the main two, but pretty much something that eats the decaying dubia roaches before the forward flies get to them.
Mm-hmm.
Ventilation helps a lot. So making sure there's lots of ventilation on the colony, and then keeping it not soaking. Fruit, water crystals, anything that sits for a couple days, especially like if it's touching egg crate, if you have any kind of substrate on there, it just creates this gunky layer when it mixes with frass, and the forward flies love it. So getting rid of any substrate and then just making sure, you're keeping up with your colony and emptying any old food and water crystals and stuff like that.
Cool. Yeah, and those buffalo beetles, they're pretty crazy. I can totally see them taking care of a lot of biomass.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
What are they called? Poor man's dermestids?
Yep.
Or something? Because they don't stop when they get to bone.
They just keep going, huh?
They just eat everything, yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's a good tip. I think there's so much more in terms of what we can do by pairing species in some cases that we really need to do it.
Oh, absolutely. I'm excited to see where, I think bioactive keeping is still in very early stages of, the hobby. Really excited to see where it is, in the next decade or two.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, with things like you were talking about the vampire crabs and things like that. And they kind of peak and troughs in their popularity and so on. But the fact that they can be bred in captivity in a bioactive setup, fascinating. Something I probably want to do someday.
Yeah.
They are fantastic.
Come to Michigan, we'll set you up.
Oh yeah. I need to get out there. So Carl Colwood, this is another patron, was saying that he's in an area where the local laws prohibit imports of exotic life quite a bit. And there are places around the country and other parts of the world where that is a big thing, and of course, and is wondering if there is an anticipation that the market trend, if these laws keep building and it turns out we're all kind of stuck in our own states with what we have, is there an anticipation the market trend will shift more to technical equipment, veterinary support, that kind of thing, instead of national level shipments? So is that anything that Josh's Frogs is concerned about or looking forward and seeing that might be a thing?
Not really, no. I mean, you look at the amount of, let's call them exotic animals, pretty much your not dog and cat. How many of those animals are in people's houses compared to what it was 5-10 years ago, even 2 years ago? I don't ever see, that market and that demand dropping, as well as just looking at, the legality side of it. And government cracks down on stuff. I don't see it really affecting us in that sense, in the sense that, we're switching more towards only selling husbandry type equipment other than the animals.
Okay. Yeah, I certainly hope it never gets to that point. And I think you're right. We were able to kind of beat back the last attempt to take that away, our freedoms to keep such creatures away. And I think as awareness increases and as popularity increases, hand in hand, we'll be able to hopefully keep that under control on
Yeah.
a national level at least. But there are some local people dealing with that, of course, and I don't want to diminish that. But.
Yeah, and I think there always will be, special cases in specific areas that are very, strict on what you can and can't get.
Right.
But yeah, kind of like what you were saying with, this last, let's call it a scare, this last whole thing of, keeping animals and crossing state lines and stuff like that. But I think that was like one of the first real times, just that awareness was so loud that how many animal keepers and how many of us, stood up and got together and wrote to our senators and made postings. And like, I mean, if I was the government, I would be like, okay, this is a little more than I was expecting.
Right. And apparently there was some of that reaction, and that's a positive for us for sure.
Yeah.
And I remember I've heard about rumors of laws like this in various places for decades, but now social media have made it something it's more feasible for us to band together and have our voices heard, which is great.
Yeah.
All right. So on a large scale, you mentioned you've had to deal with phorid flies, and I'm wondering if you've had to deal with mites. The Learning Isopod Man is wondering about that. And I think mites there's a lot of misunderstandings about mites, but what are your thoughts, both Phil and Logan, if you want to chime in on this one, about mites and isopod cultures?
So I think definitely as far as mites in the colonies or in the cultures, it kind of depends on what type of mite. Like that definitely has a huge effect on just the effect the mite has in general. Like you're going to see different detritus mites and predatory mites and just different soil mites, just different types in general. And they're all going to have different prey items or food items that they're searching for. And that's all kind of unique to the mite.
Yeah.
Like you're saying, each one's different. So there's some that, you see, scomitous predatory mites in your springtail culture. Like that's not that great. Where you see just soil detritus mites in your isopod or springtail culture. You're like, yeah, it's not ideal, but I'm not worried about my isopod safety right now or anything like that.
Right.
We do, have them pop up. Not as surprisingly, not very often in our isopods. I don't even remember the last time we even really had to deal with mites in any of our isopods. They'll pop up in our springtails. They're not too bad to get rid of. The eradicated, the soil mites are trickier. But I just kind of wait for them to all clump up on the food, manually scoop them out after multiple times. We've also found that the temperate springtails are surprisingly cold tolerant. So you can actually take your whole springtail culture, put them in the fridge 12 hours, back out 12 hours, maybe do that a couple times, and the springtails bounce back pretty well.
But the mites, not so much.
Mites, not so much. No.
Nice. Some springtails are pretty amazing that way, what they can handle.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
You see the pictures or videos of like up in the snow and mountains of just like the puddles of isopods on, bodies of water and stuff.
Oh yeah. Just this January, I was out on a lake that was mostly frozen, or some body of water that was mostly frozen, and the little areas where it wasn't frozen, I was seeing little green springtails hopping around on the water.
That's cool. We get we have big black ones out here in the winter. We'll see.
Yeah, they're amazing creatures. I think it's interesting how springtails are starting to become a hobby too. We're getting the orange springtails and whatnot.
Yeah, we have one guy who works in the roaches who is like obsessed with springtails, and so that's what a lot of his personal collection is just his different flavors of springtails.
Yeah, I think my eyesight needs to be a little better before I specialize on something that.
Yeah, right.
But more power to him. That's cool. Okay, so Branded Guy has a follow-up question about the buffalo beetles in the doobie roach colony. How many would you put?
I mean, realistically, you can add as many as you want because they'll kind of self-regulate. They can only live off of what the environment can support. And so if, you have a colony that only has a couple dozen roaches, and so maybe you only have one death every week or 2 weeks, you can't put 100 buffalo beetles aren't going to live in there. So they'll kind of stabilize. We start ours, so we keep our colonies in like the 80 quart bins, and we usually dump in at least 100 buffalo beetles because you want to go more than you need, because like you'd rather start off with a lot and have them self-regulate down than start off with too little, because that little amount that's going to get filled by something else, and more than likely that's your phorid flies. So yeah, it's better to overshoot it.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it's amazing how quickly they will find, the whatever pest it happens to be, whether it's a fungus gnat or a phorid fly or a mite or anything, they'll find that vacuum, or even the slightly less than completely filled ecosystem. They'll find it.
Yeah, everything has a niche. Whether you put something in that niche or not, something's going to fill it.
Something's going to fill it, exactly. It's so important to get a jump on those sorts of things, whether they're adding springtails to an isopod colony before you put your isopods in, or adding plenty of buffalo beetles to the dubia colony. It's all the same principle. Okay, so another question from this is Don Gallagher. I think he's in the chat. I saw him. And again, you're the invertebrate guys, but there's a question about Pac-Man frogs, pros and cons. You want to chime in there?
Have you had one before?
Oh yeah, definitely some pros off the start. Awesome to watch, just all around great pet if you intend on not handling it so much. That's one of your big cons. They're quite bitey and tend to grab fingers if you reach your hands in.
It's a pro. What are you
Typical,
talking about?
typical Pac-Man behavior. Definitely super active during feeding, which is a pro. Super lazy otherwise, which is a con. And they're available in a huge array of colors nowadays, which is a huge pro, I think.
And they're super easy to care for.
Yeah, that's
yeah. Like they're one of the best, I'd say one of the best like beginner frogs. They're like frog puddles is what I call them. Because they make their little burrow, they sit in that burrow, and they're happy with it until food comes. It's like a little frog puddle.
Yeah. My daughter has one, and he's great, and he'll call once in a while, and that's fun. And he grew like a weed super quickly, and now he's essentially full grown. But the bitey thing that you mentioned, once she was cleaning up something in his vivarium, and she didn't realize how far away he would strike.
Oh yeah.
And so he grabbed onto her finger, and took a little minute for me to get it off, gently, carefully work it off of her finger. In the meantime, she was kind of panicking a little bit.
Yeah, that's traumatizing.
Yeah, she didn't realize how much, they can really grip.
Oh
yeah. They don't have teeth though, right? I know pixie frogs have little teeth.
Yeah.
I don't know about Pac-Man. I will say this about Pac-Man, only because I recently learned this, is you have to change out their substrate somewhat regularly because they'll get nitrogen burns on their belly.
Yeah, exactly. And you have to watch the type of substrate you put in there. But as soon as you get too much nitrogenous waste in there, you can get first the nitrogen burns, and if it doesn't get rectified pretty quickly, it just die. Yeah, it's true. So they're very cool. So maybe you should get one down. They're fun. Just watch your fingers. And it's great to have around. If I have, I don't do it too often because you don't want to give them too many. But once in a while, if I have my snakes don't want the pinky, I can toss the pinky to the frog and it'll eat it. But I try not to do that very often because it's not a great diet to do that too often.
I do the same with my pixie frog, like a garbage disposal for the snakes.
Yep. It's been fun. I've enjoyed it, and I think there's conflicting information out there about what temperatures they should be kept at. We kind of are on the warm side with ours. We have a heat mat and a thermostat and keep it fairly warm, so it's in the with a night drop, but during the daytime it's in like high 70s, low 80s, and then at night it cools down a little bit. What would you say about that?
I would agree with that. That's personally what I've heard is the best and how I keep my current Pac-Man frog myself.
High 70s. That's what I've heard.
Yeah.
Heat mat, thermostat. Yeah,
seems to do really, really well with that. And I've heard people say that, well, in the ground in the tropics, so it's going to be cooler, and maybe to some extent that's true. But I've heard other people say, well, you keep them too cool, and they start having immune system issues, and
Yeah.
Okay. So this is a great question. I've learned the answer to this one through sad experience, but either one of you want to chime in on this one?
Yeah, they're hard to tell apart at first glance. Honestly, it took me a while just to learn the difference just at first glance. Forward flies tend to have a bit more of a hump on their thorax. I'm trying to think of anything else. They're a bit bigger. They're a bit chunkier. They also, like fruit flies, typically we only see them around like fruit or like rotting fruits, the fruit fly media. But forward flies, they like everything. They'll go after fruits. They'll go after sugars. They'll go after decaying things. We see them everywhere.
Cool. And one thing I've noticed about forward flies too is that when they are, and I've noticed the things you're mentioning, but also they will tend to run a lot more on a surface than a fungus gnat will. Fungus gnats will run too, but fungus gnats are a lot more likely to take off.
Yeah.
Just in general than a forward fly is.
I totally misread that. I was thinking forward fly versus fruit fly.
Well, the fact that they have more of a hump and that they're larger is also true of fungus gnats, so it totally works. Yeah. All right. Another one. Scorpions. Do they deal well with isopods and springtails?
See, that's a hard one. I think it kind of depends on the scorpion. So if you're talking arid, there's currently, or at least to my knowledge, there's no truly arid springtails that are available that are going to survive with like no moisture, like your desert scorpion would for the most part. Some of your isopods, there's definitely some varieties that could tolerate those arid conditions as long as they had a moist retreat to kind of go to, keeping in mind that a scorpion's a generalist predator and it's going to eat the isopods if it gets the opportunity to.
Right.
I think it's definitely more applicable for like a tropical scorpion for sure.
I think you could probably keep some dwarf fossorials in with, especially like something big like I'm picturing like Asian forest scorpion.
Yep.
You put in dwarf whites, dwarf purples, like that scorpion's probably never going to come across them. And even if he does, we'll snack.
Yeah, that's true. I have some dwarf purples in with my Asian forest scorpion. It seems to be working pretty well.
Nice.
Yeah, it's a good way to go. So here's an interesting one for the scale with which you're working with isopods. I have my own ideas about how calcium and isopods work, but what do you think? Do you supplement calcium separate from the food? And if so, how do you do it with your big cultures?
So yeah, we do give it separate than the food. The food, of course, has got some calcium enhancement in it, but we use cuttle bones. So every colony has an entire cuttle bone to itself, and we just kind of replace those as they finally reach the end of their life, which takes quite a while, a couple of years. And then we're adding typically like a mineral powder, so like a mix of minerals into the substrate, just so there's kind of like a more natural source of minerals throughout the substrate.
That's cool.
What was that stone that we were using for a bit?
Texas Holy Rock was a good stone used as well for calcium for a lot of isopods, especially like cave dwellers.
Like some of the cubaris.
Yep.
And did you watch them wear it down? Was it?
Oh yeah. It's noticeable. They've widened quite a few holes in the individual kind of pieces. Yeah,
I've seen them do things like that in cork bark if you keep a piece in there long enough in the culture. So that makes sense. Yeah. They would eventually gnaw it down. Let's see. I saw another question I wanted to get. Okay. Oh, I was thinking, I wonder if Venezuela parvis would be okay with some of the scorpions, the desert scorpions, as long as they'd still need a moist retreat, but they'd probably be pretty well suited to a situation like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's see. And Pronosis for arid scorpions.
I sometimes recommend Pronosis for arid enclosures, only if, like for Bioactive, only if there is a true moist hide in the enclosure. So like say if someone's getting a leopard gecko or a gecko, that stays arid but still needs a moist hide, I'll still recommend isopods and springtails to them, but I'll let them know they're going to live in this one little area, and that's it. You'll probably see them at night, but that's kind of going to be the heaven right there.
Yeah, that's what I've seen too. They do great with leopard geckos, but they do have to have that moist area, and if it even gets a little dry for not very long, it doesn't take long, and then suddenly you don't have isopods in it anymore.
Right. Yeah.
Here's some praise for Josh's Frog's Millie Mix. It is apparently the bomb.
Well, just wait, because 2.0 is right around the corner.
Oh, cool. Yeah, it looks like okay, so Texas Holy Rock, Aunt Cindy Skinks is asking about that. It's spelled Holey, right?
Yeah. I think
Holy
it's a type of limestone that kind of gets these holes worn in it. People typically use it for fish tanks, which is where that's yet again coming in handy. Have some of that aquarium knowledge, is that we know that it's mostly calcium, and we figured with all those little caverns, why not give it a shot to try and emulate kind of those cave-like structures.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Okay, so do you really need a cleanup crew in a super arid environment?
It doesn't hurt. I mean, if you can try to put a cleanup crew in there, why not? It's going to help. But at the same time, in an arid enclosure, you're not really worried as much about like pathogens and stuff as you are like a tropical environment. I mean, you think about just take a dead leaf, for instance. You drop a dead leaf in a dart frog vivarium, it's going to be gone within a week, just because everything where, you drop it in an arid enclosure, everything just dries up, not a whole lot going on. And so that's when you kind of have to manually clean it yourself some more.
Yeah. That makes sense. There's just going to be less going on biologically in it when there's basically very little moisture.
Yeah.
I know some people have worked with blue death fanning beetles as a cleanup crew for things like leopard geckos or desert hairy scorpions. And though I have a leopard gecko and I have a desert hairy scorpion, I have not tried that.
I'd be curious how much bioload like death fang beetles can really handle.
Me too.
Because they don't breed very well in captivity, right?
Well, yeah, not in an extremely dry environment.
Yeah.
When I have bred the death fanning beetles, you have to keep the at least a portion of the substrate, almost like with isopods. A portion of the substrate has to be moist for the larvae. The adults can handle bone dry for years as long as they get moisture from their food, but the larvae cannot.
Interesting. So if you were to use them as cleanup crew, you'd have to like maybe go and replenish them or something if it wasn't working out. Yeah,
and breeding them is not it's not like doing superworms or something. It's an involved business because you have to incubate the larvae to induce pupation at a worm temperature, at specific humidity, and it I think it's cool that people are doing it now, but it's not nearly as practical as other invertebrates.
Sounds pretty hands-on for a cleanup crew.
Yeah, maybe not the best option for that, but they're pretty cool. Cuddle buns have getting moldy. Have you ever had that issue?
So we've not noticed that issue, but I have a theory that those might be potentially the kind of like the formed cuttle bones, where it's not actually a cuttle bone. It's just kind of like calcium carbonate that's pressed with either some like sugar or flavorings or something like that. And it's typically advertised towards birds. If that's the case, that could definitely be contributing to that mold.
That would make sense. So they put the sugar or whatever in it to be attractive to the birds, so they'll gnaw on it. And it's also attractive to mold.
Like kids too.
Let's see. Okay, I'm just going through the chat here, making sure there's some more relevant questions there. Cool. All right. So what is the beginner arthropod? And you can each give us your ideas, what you think the a good beginner arthropod would be. You can chime in on the reptile if you want to as well, but let's focus on the arthropod for now.
Well, I first got into this hobby through spiders and tarantulas and arachnids and stuff. So that's kind of where I think first. So I would say probably a cool like Brachypelma tarantula, something that's terrestrial, so you don't have to worry about it running on walls, and they're a little slower, so they're not as freaky, but still get big and colorful and are fun feeding responses.
I think I would probably have to advocate for one of the larger, kind of more tolerant isopods, probably like Procelio laevis, Armadillidium vulgare, Procelio scaber. Any of those kind of make great pets as like a beginner arthropod, I think, because they're really forgiving if you do make mistakes, and they're going to kind of teach you as you go along and kind of get used to their behavior and kind of the way that they need to be taken care of.
Isopods are nice in the sense that they're quickly rewarding. Like you get an X count of isopods and you set them up, and once they start breeding, you feel very good about it. And so, I mean, I'd say, I love getting people into isopods for the first time and just watching them go down the rabbit hole.
And there's a funny thing about both keeping isopods and keeping tarantulas, that almost no one starts out with one species and stays with one species. They're both pretty addictive that way. You want to kind of branch out and try different species and see what's going on. But it's a good point too, that the isopods are more of it's not instant gratification, but it's quick,
right,
in a short period of time. Whereas you get a tiny little sling and it might be years before you get to see its adult coloration. Or see much of it at all in some cases. All right, here's a question that a lot of people ask. What has been your experience with dwarf isopods eating molting critters?
So we typically will not recommend dwarf whites for arthropods for this reason. We've heard reports of it. I don't believe this has ever happened to us. I think we've definitely talked with some other vendors about this issue and kind of gathered together different people's thoughts on the matter just to kind of get a grasp on it. And from what we've heard and what we've seen, I do think that the risk is there. But I think you also have to keep in mind, if you're not supplementally feeding, and it kind of goes back to where we were earlier, depends on how much you're putting in to how much it's able to produce. And if you build up a really big population of dwarf whites in with your one large arthropod that maybe doesn't produce a lot of waste, and you're not supplementally feeding them enough or pulling them out to kind of keep control of that population, you're just letting them get hungrier and hungrier and hungrier. And then when that nice, freshly molted big tarantula or scorpion rolls by, it's going to look real soft and tasty.
Or a really fancy tarantula egg sac or something.
Yeah,
for the longest time, everyone thought that dwarf whites didn't touch fertile egg sacs. They only touched infertile egg sacs. But that's kind of been busted over the last couple of years or so.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's so many factors that are involved in when isopods will or will not go after food, and it relates to so many things that blanket statements like they won't ever touch things are a little hard to make. And in some cases you may have a situation where it works because you're making sure that those isopods are getting what they need and they're not going to be as desperate. And another situation that's fairly similar but just differs in a few particulars might make the difference and tip the balance.
Yeah, exactly.
So Ruben was asking about smaller cubaris species like Pakchong. Have you worked with Pakchong as a bioactive isopod?
We are unfortunately limited to Cubaris marina.
Okay.
Yep.
Haven't worked with that one. Yeah, I haven't worked with Pakchong at all myself. I think Cubaris Pakchongs are the ones that can climb, though, so they might not be a great cleanup crew ones. They can climb smooth surfaces, I'm thinking.
I will say I use Panda Kings as a cleanup crew back home on a 115 gallon, and they are surprisingly good.
Excellent.
Yeah, yeah, just watching them. I mean, I found, Cubaris like decaying bugs way more than vegetation, fruit, veggies, like anything I've offered them so far. So
They do seem to be kind of crazy as far as reproduction and so on for Cubaris and hardiness. They seem to be good ones.
Yeah, it's just, getting enough Cubaris to start off a good, cleanup crew.
Yeah, true. What are they cleaning up for?
It's just a big plants and domino roaches and, bugs. So luckily it's not like it's not vertebrates or anything that has like a huge bio load, just other arthropods.
Okay. So what do you feed your isopods in your colonies? Nolan was asking about that.
Okay. For within the business, we definitely use like Repashy Bug Burger and Morningwood.
Mm-hmm.
And we're working on our own specialized isopod diet that kind of fulfills all their needs.
It's going to be cool.
Yeah.
Another one that I like to use too is the Supreme Isopod Chow. They go after that. Did I misread that question? I thought we were talking about food. Did I click on the wrong question?
I was wondering. Yeah.
Sorry. I may have confused questions, or I may have just misread it. I don't know.
That's all right.
There's a lot of questions. Sometimes I'm.
Well, now I don't feel bad for misreading the question earlier.
Okay. So what about isopods and springtails with no other inhabitants? Have either of you done a lot with that?
Mm-hmm.
Where you have a terrarium with nothing but isopods and springtails?
Yeah,
Yep.
like a fancier springtails or fancier isopods. Yeah, definitely. The trick I'd say is starting off as clean as possible, especially for springtails. Like if you can sterilize your substrate and wipe out the cup or culture container, as much as you can do for springtails, the better.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, absolutely.
And definitely be careful with the amount of resources that you put into set enclosures, especially because you don't want to give them too little and have them destroy whatever nice environment you've made for them. But you also don't want to give them too much to where they kind of grow and overwhelm that environment either.
Good point. It's all about that balance, right?
Mm-hmm.
It can be harder to strike than you might think. Yeah, sorry about that, Nolan. I messed up. I thought you were talking about food for some reason, and you were talking about a toad. Good beginner toad. So sorry about that. Let's see. I guess we're actually getting close to our time. I wanted to make sure that if people want to check out Josh's Frogs, of course, I've got the website here, but if they have questions and want to reach out, what is the best way for them to do that?
Just email. I'm trying to remember. It's just the customer service email if you Google us. But all of those emails and questions get directed to the corresponding departments. So if you were to send an email asking about isopods or bugs, that would come to me. And then either I could answer it or I could give it to Phil and he could answer it. But yeah, we're also pretty good at getting on that within a day or two.
Awesome. That is great. Great to know. And we had good viewership today. We had a lot of people. I noticed our numbers got pretty high. We had a little while ago, there were quite a few people in here. So we've had some great numbers. I've had a great time chatting with you guys. So I hope a lot of people got to have their questions answered and so on.
Yeah.
Made some really great points. Sorry, I didn't mean to step over you.
No, I'm sorry. I was just saying this has been real fun.
Yeah, for me too. Is there anything that I kind of missed or glossed over that you'd like to bring up before we wrap up?
I think one of the main things is keep your eyes out. We're always adding new stuff, new isopods, new microfauna, new things in the work, lots of things right around the corner. Just pay attention and see what comes out.
Yeah, I was just looking at the website before we went on and noticed some things I had never seen there before. So
awesome.
It's happening.
Yep, things are happening.
Well, would you guys mind staying on for just a second after I end the broadcast?
Yeah,
not at all.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again for joining us.
Thank
Phil
you, everyone who listened to us.
Thank you for having us.
All right. Have a good night, everybody.